Welcome to the HGR Digital Asset Group podcast series, where we interview thought leaders in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space. Today, we are very excited to have Miko Matsumura, founder of crypto exchange Evercoin and venture partner with BitBull Capital. So, Miko, thanks for joining us. Tao and I have some questions for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and looking forward to an exciting podcast.
Tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you've been doing in the blockchain crypto space.
Sure. So I have kind of a classic nerd background. I guess I got my start in computing all the way back in the, my first computer had 16K of RAM, which is kind of smaller than an average like GIF image, so non-animated, it's a tiny, tiny little thing. And it was an Atari 400 computer. I was a teenager. And ever since then, I've been really obsessed with this whole phenomenon of compute, right? As probably most nerds, that's basically it. In terms of my first kind of professional exposure, I really started with the original Java programming language team back in about 25 years ago in Silicon Valley. And, ever since then, I've really been obsessed with open source. So I've been working with open source software companies, mostly startup companies and venture capital, watching how open source has effectively kind of, Mark Andreessen, the famous venture capitalist and founder of Netscape, he says software is eating the world. Mm-hmm. So I feel like the thing that's fascinating about what's happening and what's got me really excited about today is that, I've watched open source eating software. Right. So over the past 25 years working on various open source projects, I've really been excited about watching open source eating software. So to me, the thing that kind of tipped me in this crazy direction with crypto is just this feeling of how much of money is software. So the question that kind of struck me pretty deeply. So, one of the co-founders of actually the founder of Hazelcast, which is an open source project that I worked on, basically said, hey, let's start a crypto company. So that was really kind of how I first got dragged into this space. And to me, the thing that is kind of illuminating has been just the exploration of, most money is already software. So if you buy something with a credit card, you have to just think about what's happening, right? And almost all of what's happening is happening in software. Yep. And so since money is already software, you have to ask yourself the question of what kind of software should money be? Right. And to me, the conclusion that I have to come to is, if you go to bitcoin.org, the title tag on that website, which presumably the title was written by Satoshi Nakamoto, is open source peer-to-peer money. So if you start to think about it, it feels like money should be open source and it should be peer-to-peer. So I think he made a really exciting assertion at the creation of Bitcoin. And, one thing, if I can give anyone anything out of this talk, I would highly recommend reading the book called The Book of Satoshi. It's a real book. Yep. Actually, the audiobook is even better. So I listened to the whole thing, and it's amazing. It's a collection of the email writings of Satoshi Nakamoto, and it just gives you deep insight into the design mind of the creator of Bitcoin. So, that's a very inspirational book for me, and I recommend it to everyone. So I feel like that's what has got me ignited, and that's why I'm kind of busier than a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest. So, I'm definitely super active.
Yeah. So while we're on the topic of Bitcoin, and as we all know, it has had tremendous network effects from being a first mover. So Bitcoin versus Ethereum versus whichever the next crypto king is going to be, is this a winner-take-all battle? I mean, with regards to Bitcoin, Ethereum, there are arguments for each to win a different use case. The former as more of a store of value medium exchange, and the latter as crypto fuel used to run decentralized computation. So if Ethereum becomes sufficiently embedded in a big enough part of the economy and people start denominating their costs in Ethereum, can it ultimately become the store of value medium exchange token? And maybe that's the case now too.
So I super thoughtful question, and I actually hosted my own crypto meetup in San Francisco called Crypto Underground, and one of my guests, actually I interviewed in this context that I called Bitcoin Game of Thrones, right? And
Great
Bitcoin the idea of Bitcoin Game of Thrones is that Bitcoin is sitting on the Iron Throne of Westeros, right? And like all of these combatants are trying to kind of destroy them, using whatever means they can, And it was funny because I actually my host that I was interviewing was actually Monica Quaintance from Cadena Chain, and it's funny, I kind of had her portrayed almost like the Daenerys Targaryen of the blockchain, this kind of funny feeling. But the thing I wanted to get at was that I think the trope is actually wrong. It was very entertaining. But I agree with your first premise, which is that based on the study of open source projects, you tend to see what I would consider to be scoped projects, right? So for example, you see extremely popular web servers, and you see extremely popular open source databases, but you don't see like web server databases, right? So the idea that a single open source project will like absorb every possible use case and be the one size fits all open source project, like it tends not to work out that way. And the reason why is because open source competes for consent. So it competes for users, and the users vote with their feet, right? So the problem with that is fragmentation. Right? So on the one hand, you could look at it and be like, oh, it's fragmentation, it's ruining everything. But on the other hand, you could actually look at it at some measure almost like freedom, right? So in a way, it's sort of freedom to be disaggregated, and there will be use cases where it actually is a freedom to be aggregated. So, I'll give you an example. If you look at something like Cosmos, there's a really nice business case to be made that there is a universal integration fabric for multiple disparate cryptocurrencies, whether that's handled by an on-chain data protocol or whether it's handled by an exchange, the jury's out. But the point that I would make is that we should see heterogeneity in the space, and we should see people using a bunch of things because of things like design optimizations, right? So for example, Bitcoin is like a Swiss bank account, and if you want to buy a sandwich, it's actually like your best simulation of that is to try to buy a sandwich with your Swiss bank account, using ACH, right? It's like, good luck with that. It's going to be annoying, right?
Yeah.
Like, it'll be great because the guy selling the sandwich will be like, here's the sandwich, but you can't eat it until I have enough confirmations, And it's like, no, that's not it. That's not a thing, right? So the point that I'm making is that you're going to have great optimizations for different use cases, and I don't feel like there is a universal optimization. Like there's no like this chain is good, and people are saying, oh, we're going to make a really fast chain, right? People are like, oh, 10,000 transactions per second or whatever. That's fine. There's already a system that does like way more transactions, and it's called Oracle Database.
Yep.
So the point is it's not about that. It's about the decisions. And a lot of people question Bitcoin, and they're like, oh, it's so slow and it burns so much electricity. It's only doing that because it doesn't trust anyone, right? So to me, people who look at Bitcoin and be like, oh, it's like first generation blockchain. Most people attacking Bitcoin are doing so for their own reasons, right? Because it's like, because they have a blockchain and they want to be the better blockchain, and they want to say, oh, Bitcoin sucks, Bitcoin's slow, right? But they fooled a lot of people. And they fooled a lot of people into thinking that Bitcoin is not kind of a back plane, right? And the reason why I argue that Bitcoin is a back plane is it's solving the hardest problem in third-party trust, right? Which is it's basically like making it economically and thermodynamically impractical to lie.
Yep.
And as the functional result, every single entry in the ledger is exactly what happened.
Yep.
And there's not a single human that can point to any ledger entry on Bitcoin and say that's not what happened, which is amazing. Like that's an amazing achievement for like zero third-party trust. So because of that, I believe Bitcoin is a fundamental. I don't necessarily believe that it will be in the Iron Throne forever. It may not be the most valuable, but what I will say is that I think that protocol is valuable. It's a valuable protocol. So I don't know, there's plenty of people that are like, oh, Bitcoin first generation blockchain, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify that, and you said, of course, clearly a very well considered and educated perspective, but there are definitely people who are just like,
I think like what most people fail to realize is like there's actually a ton of development behind Bitcoin's team right now, but then people fail to realize about like what is actually going on. They only like focus on like Ethereum, Cardano, and so forth. Like they fail to realize Bitcoin has a ton of stuff going on right now.
Yeah, and if you actually look at the advancement of the code base, it is very mature and robust and tested and scrutinized. And it probably has, if you look at just the development, it's probably certainly the most mature and robust. But like, if you look at the number of people that have actually like looked through the source code, it's crazily well introspected. Like, the reward for cracking that is like billions of dollars, right? And no one's cracked it. So like, that's pretty nice. That's a nice achievement.
And then what people fail to realize is Bitcoin is probably the only cryptocurrency that has survived for more than 5 years. Like Ethereum has been around for 4 years and 3 or 4 years. Like Bitcoin is like a tried and true technology out there. So
yeah, which is incredible. And some people say, like, if you look at the fluctuations in the price, one way I look at that is I look at it as someone who's standing on a bridge that they know is going to collapse, right? Which is the actual fiat economy. And they're actually testing this other bridge, right? So they're putting weight, they're shifting their weight, and they're like, I'm going to put... And if you actually look at the amount of weight that they've shifted, they've really only shifted about 1% of their weight onto the Bitcoin bridge, And then they come back, right? What would happen if we shifted 2% of the world economy onto the Bitcoin bridge? Trillions of dollars, anyone? So like, so to me, but what's fascinating about what's happened is each time that weight has been shifted onto Bitcoin, the technology is held up, right? Like as a store of value, it stored the value, right? So, people came back and they're like, oh, you still have that? And it's like, oh, I still do. It's still here. It's like, there you go. So I agree with you. It's a tremendous achievement.
Yeah. I think earlier you brought up a good point that, a lot of people are putting information out there for their own purposes. So because it's still very uncharted territory, it's really hard for consumers or your general mass to separate the truth from something that's made up by someone with their own selfish interests. So I think, that's why it's good to have someone like you on our podcast give real thought leadership into some of the issues that people are wondering. In your blog, we've seen you talk about this phenomenon of people being comfortable leaving their holdings on a centralized exchange. And obviously, there's been like high-profile hacks, shutdowns, and scams associated with centralized exchange. So noting your potential bias here with your involvement in Evercoin, is the solution to these centralized exchange pain points closer to a non-custodial exchange like Shapeshift or Evercoin, a purely decentralized exchange like EtherDelta, or something in between like ZRX? And what are the various trade-offs?
Yeah, thank you for that. So to me, there are two kind of orthogonal dimensional axes. So what I mean is that centralization versus decentralization is the popular trend, and that the word centralization has come to mean bad, and the word decentralization has come to mean good, right? But the thing that's really funny about all of that phenomenon is that decentralization in some ways it's not necessarily the perfect answer to all problems, right? So to me, the dimensional axis that's really important or salient here is actually custodial versus non-custodial. And what I wanted to say about that is like what you have to understand. So what I said earlier about the Bitcoin blockchain is I said, according to the rules of Bitcoin, everything that happened is undeniably what happened, right? But there are two huge things in the rules of Bitcoin that people are not doing a great job of. I think one of the things in the rules of Bitcoin is basically this notion that if you transfer, so one of the things is if you have the private key, you're the owner, right? That's one of the laws of Bitcoin. The other important law from a user perspective is that it's basically like irreversible and immutable, right? So those are all the laws, right? So, the less material one is that if you transfer someone Bitcoin and it turns out to have been the wrong person, you're screwed. That's clear. And that's happening all the time, right? And it's happening with other currencies like Ether and ICOs and scams and exit scams and all this stuff. So that's kind of what I would call the second law. The second law is kind of immutability and that kind of thing. But the first law is the blockchain only recognizes you if you hold the private key, right? So what that means is it means that every single user of Bittrex and Binance and Poloniex and Kraken and Coinbase, like the blockchain does not recognize any of those users. The blockchain considers all of those users to have no standing. So if you just show up, the blockchain looks at you and says, who it is. Right? So that's crazy, right? It's crazy that we're doing that. Why are we doing that? We're doing that so I have this model, right? And I call this first, second, and third party trust, right? So Satoshi Nakamoto solved basically the problem of third party trust, right? Which is when you're doing a transaction, you don't need to trust the third party, which is the intermediary. So the intermediary continues to exist, but you don't require the trust of that because the blockchain has made it kind of super expensive to lie and not worth it. Right? So the question then becomes the problem of second party trust. And second party trust is basically like, who is the other party? And the thing that's really important about what's happening, what people don't understand, is they don't understand that custodial exchanges, which are currently generally referred to as centralized exchanges, hold your asset for you, and you don't even have custody of that asset. So that just means that you have no standing, right? And that's bad. And the thing that's scary is that most of the major cryptocurrency exchange hacks kind of look like inside jobs, right? And so, because how else would you get the keys?
Yeah.
Like somehow someone got the keys, and somehow the keys were used to like push the funds out of the big wallet. So it's a scary thing. So I guess long story short, in talking about the solution, I think whatever solution is, whether it's centralized or decentralized, should be non-custodial. So the point is that as uncomfortable as it may be, end users will have to, in some form, manage their own private key. Now, what I will say is that there may be wonderful solutions coming that tie their private key to multi-factor biometric identification. So for example, like fingerprint, face recognition, face recognition with like animation, video, whatever, video face recognition. So there may be like multi factors that make it less complicated, because at the moment it's pretty complicated. And that's bad. Yeah. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're going to move towards a future where people are in control of their own destiny. Yeah.
But right now they're not necessarily empowered.
That's it. And it's, I don't know. And the cryptocurrency community desperately needs to fix the user experience. Yeah. It's broken.
Okay. So now I move on to the topic of stablecoins. Do you think it's a big killer app? There's definitely been a lot of hype and theoretical discourse on these projects. So for instance, Maker, Basecoin. But what are some of the major challenges of developing a price stable crypto asset?
Well, I mean, the thing that happens with the price stable crypto asset is that there really are only two broad classes of these types of projects, right? Like one of the broad classes is just kind of what I would consider to be sort of a linear asset backing, right? So linear asset backing is basically this notion of like it's if you go back to like the 1970s and Richard Nixon, the United States used to be on the bimetallic standard, right? Which means that every dollar was actually backed by Fort Knox, and you could actually go and cash it in. I used to have a $5 bill that said silver certificate on it, which is crazy. Wow. Yeah, it was really weird. I spent it. It was kind of stupid, but you could go to Fort Knox and you could be like, "Can I have my silver, please?" Right? Super crazy. So that's a stable currency, right? But obviously the United States abandoned that and started because there wasn't enough gold in Fort Knox. There wasn't enough silver in Fort Knox. It was over. And so at some point they just kept printing more and it was over, right? So, so that's one approach. And in theory, that's kind of the Tether approach.
In theory.
In theory. I mean, people are worried about it. And in a way, I think that one of the problems implicit in Tether is kind of like what I would call the Trump tax return problem, which is that if they're not disclosing, then they must be hiding something. Right? Like that's the thesis. So at the moment, it's complicated. But I don't want to get too far down that hole. But I think what I did want to say about that is the other approach that I think is more contemporary is now moving into kind of like a stable coin plus a moon coin, right? Which is kind of that base coin, base bonds disclosure. I'm investing in Basecoin, but through Pantera Capital as well as individually. But what I do want to say about that pattern is it actually establishes a foundation of central banking within the crypto world, right? So the thing that is really interesting becomes that you have a mechanism that allows the regulation of the price based on a reserve. But the question becomes kind of, how do you manage the reserve, and in order to ensure stability in times of extreme volatility, right? So that's the problem. And to me, one of the things that's super complicated is that central banking has already been proven to be problematic, right? And so the point is having a crypto solution for central banking, it's still central banking, right? Even if it's, there isn't a way to decentralize central banking, at least that I know of. That might be the most interesting solution, is to have a central bank that's decentralized. But I haven't seen one of those yet.
But then you can't really decentralize central banking, right? I mean, those two words don't go hand in hand.
I love your mindset, but what I mean by that is let me reframe it, which is a decentralized implementer of a monetary policy that protects the economy.
Okay.
Right. So that's I think you totally nailed me on that, which is yeah, but the reason why I think monetary policy is key is because it really relates to control over the money supply as a lever to kind of like manage an economy. But I guess the thing that is concerning about this whole thing is that I think in some level the passion for stable coins is warranted, and I think it's going to be extremely valuable. I think securitized asset-backed tokens is also like a huge trend. And I think both of those things will actually increase the stability of the crypto economy and will actually allow crypto-to-crypto stabilization. Like at the moment, what's happening is when people want to exit crypto, many people are using Tether. But I feel like if you have like a huge number of base assets, including things like real estate and all these other things, like a real estate-backed token should see a liquidity premium of maybe 20%, but it's not going to go to the moon.
Of course not.
Yeah, it can't, right? But the thing that's really interesting about those crypto assets is it allows people to move in and out of crypto while staying in crypto, right? In other words, they're not being exposed to traditional crypto, which is volatile. They're being exposed to new crypto, and so they, so they can hedge back and forth, which I think is great. So to me, that's part of the process of the crypto economy eating the real economy, which I think is inevitable. So I guess what I wanted to say really ultimately about stablecoins, though, is that the challenge of a stablecoin is, one of the things that when you can look at stablecoins, one of the things you can look at are playbooks like what's happening with like the Polymaths and the securitizers of the world, which is that they really want to liquefy all assets, right? And the thing that's interesting about the liquefaction of all assets is that might actually provide a fair backing substrate, right? So instead of saying, oh, we're on the gold standard, we're on the silver standard, what if we're on the everything standard, right? Because then you actually have a very large basket, right? And that's nice, because that's a very nice place to stand, right? So that's a very large, firm place to stand, because, it's harder for everything to go to zero. Right. And there are certain situations where like things like food or certain things are going to retain value even in the most adverse situations.
Hopefully anyways.
Yeah, I hope so.
So price stability of cryptos, that's one pain point, but there's also a lot of other pain points at the infrastructure level. So at HGR, we've been talking a lot about middleware type project that could solve some of those crypto to crypto pain points, such as off-chain scaling, back-end decentralized exchange, digital identity. We think that these will see value realized quicker in the short term. But, from your perspective, what are some of the middleware level projects that you like to see people built upon in the next, year or 2 years?
Well, one of the projects that I'm advising is the Hub token, and the Hub protocol is an attempt to address problems in second-party trust, which I think is exciting, right? So to me, when you're really looking at transaction, like one of the biggest things that's happening in blockchain is that people are super confused. I think they're super confused about the rules of blockchain and how custodial exchanges work or don't work. So that's one thing they're confused about. But the other thing they're super confused about is trust, right? Because everyone's running around yelling that everything's trustless now, right?
Yeah.
And what's amazing is the conflation between third-party trust and second-party trust, right? Which is, you know, like ICOs are basically people walking up to people they've never met and handing them stacks of cash, right? So like, that's weird. Like, that's weird behavior. And it's like, why are people doing that? They're doing that for a lot of really wrong reasons. You know, so for me, one of the things that's really interesting is kind of how can you build appropriate kind of staking mechanisms, and how can you create appropriate kinds of like log histories of behaviors? Because ultimately, like, you know, in a professional or commercial context, trust is mostly about a prediction of future behavior based on past behavior in a commercial context, right? So once you've reduced it to that kind of a equation, then you have potential for creating some kind of like approach that will increase or improve the ability for people to establish quantifiable trust at a distance, right? So that's a infrastructure that I think is missing and potentially valuable. Because when you look at the Internet of Value, I think that, you know, Nick Szabo said that like not only does Bitcoin produce like a gold-like storage of value, but also a unprecedented transmission of value over distance.
Yeah.
Right. But to me, one way of quantifying the safety of that distance is through trust. Right. So the more trust you have, the more safely you can transmit. And you know, obviously there's other like super deep problems like just basic cybersecurity. You know, and things like identity fraud and you know all kinds of things, right? But like, you know, to me, something like Hub Protocol is really focused on just like looking at the behavioral aspect of it, and hoping for others to solve problems like, you know, identity attestation, and you know, and there are great solutions that are being developed for those kinds of components.
That's right.
Yeah. So one final question that I have is, so in your blog, you echo our sentiment of diversify or die, that we as investors must appreciate that we cannot be clairvoyant about which asset wins when there's an explosion of blockchain projects out there. The solution to this is, of course, to build a humble portfolio where we stake out bets across multiple horses running on each track or each use case. When you look at the over 1,000 cryptocurrencies that exist today, how do you go about evaluating which horses to back?
Yeah, that's super valuable, and I want to give people another reference, which is Jason Calacanis's Angel, which is a great book about angel investing. By the way, Jason hates cryptos, I think. He gave an awesome talk at BlockCon in LA, and he said this. He said, if you invested in cryptos, you lost all your money. And if you're doing an ICO, you're going to jail. like that was his talk. So anyhow, hilarious guy, very successful angel. But read his book, and I think the excitement about the book is that you can actually see how diversified he is. He's doing 50 deals a year, right? So to me, the criteria that matter are team, the time to crypto economy, which is how quickly can you get a functioning crypto economy, and the third thing is governance. And governance is really about kind of how can you be sure that the money that's coming in is actually going to flow towards the development of the promises in the white paper.
Yeah.
Right? So you need to look. You need to be like, oh, do they have fiduciary directors? Do they have VC board members? Do they have escrow? Do they have a custody chain that makes sense? Do they have milestones? Do they have a roadmap? Do they have like founder vesting tokens? You know, what are these? All the mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
Like,
it's like, are they fit to deliver on what they
right?
promised?
Are they, you know, because you look at this giant stack of cash people are raising, and it's kind of like, what correlation does that have to anything, you know? And I think at the moment, the structures aren't there, right? So for example, like a plant needs sunlight and it needs water and it needs dirt, right? So the question then becomes like, oh, well, you've got this little pretty flower that's growing. Like, do you want to put like 60 tons of dirt on top of it? Or do you want to blast it with like 25,000 degrees of solar radiation, you know, or drown it in like 300 cubic miles of water? Like, it's like, that's not a thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, so just throwing money is not a thing. Like, you know, we have to really understand, like, what is the mechanism for delivering that value? And as investors, it's our responsibility to like ensure that those mechanisms are actually correlated with delivery. So everyone should ask those questions. And if you're curious about what I think those mechanisms are, read my white paper at icogovernance.org. That's my governance and ICO disclosure protocol that I'm trying to establish. So, you know, those are the things I ask everyone is like, hey, who gets paid what by who, when, under what circumstances?
Yeah, those are very, very good tips, and we'll definitely look into that. So thank you so much, Miko, for, you know, taking the time and sharing your insights. I think the blockchain and crypto community will really appreciate some of the things that you shared with us today.
Awesome.
So thanks
well,
again
thanks
for
so
taking
much.
the time.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Miko.